Welcome to all of you. I'm so pleased that we have such a wonderful audience. It is hardly surprising. It is hardly surprising given our speaker. With regard to whom I really don't know where to start and where to end. As a result of which I shall make it very, very brief, rather than confuse myself and confuse you in the process, and you'll get to know him better as he speaks. Of course, this is the topic. Of course, is particularly pertinent to this moment. Pertinent to this moment in a number of respects. It is particularly pertinent because we are seeing a proliferation of very, very savage wars waged by a variety of parties against each other, giving no one any quarter at all. I speak not only of ISIS, but I speak of assaults on Gaza. I speak of growing religious intolerance, which transforms itself into operational, political, and military forms, as if the gates of hell have opened and have not yet closed, and are about to close in the foreseeable future. So, what I'm hoping is that Professor Achcar's talk will open up a very broad panoply of issues that we might be able to discuss regarding the very broad theme of the relationship between religion and politics, particularly religious mobilization and political mobilization, which applies, as a matter of fact, across the board. Professor Achcar has been for long involved in research on matters such as this. I would like to mention, first of all, his book on the Arabs and the Holocaust, which has been read very widely indeed, and a book with a wonderful title written after the breakout of the clash of civilizations, called The Clash of Barbarisms, which brings us back to the prefatory remarks that I had made at the beginning. We do indeed live in a situation which is beset with many dangers, and these dangers are not geographically confined. They may be geographically located, but they are not geographically confined, and they are likely to spread. On this note, I shall now ask Professor Achcar to give us the benefit of his knowledge, of his wisdom, and of his intelligence. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and thank you. I'm grateful to Central European University, to the Center for Religious Study, and my dear friend Aziz, and also to the efficient organization of my visit by my Islamophobia here present. Very grateful to you all for this opportunity to have some exchange over issues that I suggested as a theme for this evening. The title that I suggested is Religion and Humanism in the Arab-Israeli War of Narratives. And this is also an allusion to the book that Aziz just mentioned, my book on the Arabs and the Holocaust, the subtitle of which is The Arab-Israeli War of Narratives. And this is what I'll be addressing and trying to discuss. And starting by emphasizing the fact that I do believe that there is hardly any conflict, and probably no conflict at all, that can match the Arab-Israeli conflict when it comes to this dimension, the war of narratives. I think this is, of all conflicts, probably the one where this dimension has taken the greatest importance. And this has objective reasons, not because the Israelis and the Arabs are great narratives, but I think it has reasons which can be explained politically and objectively. It's on the one hand the the fact that the Zionist project was a colonial project without a colonial metropolis behind it. So it had to find support. It was in need. It was structurally in need of foreign support. It could not fulfill the project of building a state in Palestine without foreign support. And the situation went along with the state of Israel being structurally dependent on foreign support, presently on U.S. funding and army. So in this structural dependence, we find one key reason for this importance of the war of narratives addressed, because the war of narratives are not, of course, usually war of narratives are not attempts by each side to convince the other. War of narratives in trying to convince the rest of the world, the rest of the other peoples. And we have also on the Arab side what became essentially evident after 1967, when the view of the Arabs as being willing or able to overwhelm the Israeli state was then a decisive blow by the Israeli victory in the June 1967 war, and we had a shift towards a more Palestinian-centered perception of the struggle, with the Palestinians understanding that they themselves need foreign support and that the overwhelming superiority of Israel when it comes to the military force should be countered by, if you want, by asymmetrical means, and this in their case it's where the war of narratives comes into the picture. And that's also the time when the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, managed to involve people like Gilbert Achcar and the rest who crafted the Palestinian side in this war of narratives. So you have these structural reasons, the congenital one, if you want, in Zionism, that you have from the start, and the unfolding of the Palestinian struggle after 1967. All this are factors, contributing to explaining the importance of the war of narratives in this particular conflict. And this is, again, as I said, I think, a key feature of that. Now, from the start, because of these reasons, we weren't confronted with just a clash of nationalisms, as you have in so many national conflicts, where each side has its own its own narrative purely for internal, domestic, if you want, consumption, plus maybe a fight about right, but right being understood in the narrow judicial meaning. Some of the kind of things that you could settle with international courts. Here we have a much more encompassing kind of war of narratives in this conflict. And indeed, we have seen also a mobilization of the full spectrum of political ideologies and ethical values and political principles in this confrontation. So that's what I'm trying to explore in this, of course, brief presentation, given the topic, and be able just to outline some aspects of the problem and not more. As you know, there is here again another difference between the Zionist movement, which is itself originally an ideological movement, and the initial confrontation with the Arab, the usually called the Arab world, in the fact that the Zionist movement was itself, or was from the beginning, one ideological current, among others, among European Jews. You had the liberal assimilationists, as they are called. You had the Marxist, the socialists, who were quite strongly represented among European Jews. You had even some form of socialist nationalism, but non-Zionist, represented by the Bund. And you had the Zionists, and they were for long minority among European Jews. So we have already here a political current which is itself the product of ideological struggle. Now, this current, political Zionism, as it is called, or also statist Zionism, as I would call it, that is the brand of Zionism that advocated the creation, the foundation of a state, which was later to be in Palestine. So this current is connected to the name of its, in many ways, its founder as modern political Zionism, who is Theodor Herzl. And the book that is regarded as a manifesto of Zionism, and we have here from the beginning, although this is an ideological current, but we have even its manifesto, even in Herzl's book, we can find a heterogeneous mixture of political views and, I would say, ethical values, which also characterizes the period when the book came out, that is the late 19th century, which was a book very much inscribed in the zeitgeist, as Hannah Arendt, for instance, would say in a comment on Herzl a few decades after that. The book includes an appeal, of course, because of what I said about the structural need for Zionism to get foreign support. There's an attempt at appealing to the global powers that be of the time, and that's why we find in the book obvious presence of the colonialist discourse of late 19th century colonialism, with formulas like, well-known formulas like Herzl describing the future state as an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism, and as a rampart of Europe against Asia. So the project was put in clearly colonial fashion. Now, at the same time, and due to the maybe idiosyncratic dimension of who Herzl was as a liberal itself, a secular liberal, you have a portrayal of the state as, which is inspired, or portrayal of the state as going to be inspired and built on what could be called liberal secular values, to the point that, for instance, in one sentence of the book we read, we shall keep our priests within the confine of their temples in the same way as we shall keep our professional army within the confines of their barracks. I don't need to comment a lot about how far modern present-day Israel is, on both accounts actually, from this pledge. The idea that the army and the clergy would not interfere in the administration of the state was actually to be contradicted by the whole aphoria on which the book was built, which we can find in the problems of the translation of the title of the movement. And many people here are German speakers, although German is the Judenstaat, which literally translated should be the state of the Jews. And it has been translated in most European languages, English, French, probably others, the Jewish state. You can see the nuance and the difference. But the translations have been legitimized by the fact that the kind of nationalism that the book wants to translate into the creation of the state is not one that can be regarded as based on a cultural, secular conception of the nation. That's not what is in the book, and that's why you have also this kind of title. It's not, for instance, a book based on Yiddish nationalism that could be translated in a cultural, secular form, and that's actually the Bund represented this kind of Yiddish nationalism, which refers to a culture, to a language, and not to religion at all. Whereas in Herzl's book, I mean, the Zionist project was one appealing to Jewishness and not anything else. And actually, Herzl is known to have despised Yiddish. And he wanted actually the future Judenstaat to be German speaking. That was his kind of course, this is, might sound cruel given the 20th century history, but we're speaking of the late 19th century. And we can see here the tension with the previous sentence that I read about liberal secular values. When he writes, and I'm reading that's from the book, so when he speaks about the organization of the movement, how the Zionists will organize the movement and start the settler colonial enterprise, says each group will have its rabbi traveling with his congregation. Local groups will afterwards form voluntarily about their rabbi, and each locality will have its spiritual leader. They will not need to address special meetings for the purpose. An appeal such as this may be uttered in the synagogue. And thus, it must be done. You see the contradiction with everything that came before. For we feel our historic affinity only through the faith of our fathers, the faith, as we have long ago absorbed the languages of different nations to an ineradicable degree. And here is ignoring the Yiddish, for instance, in this regard. So this tension that we have in the original message translates also in the whole contradictions in the Israeli state after its foundation about, for instance, the definition of citizenship. The law of return, which is a cornerstone, legal cornerstone of the state, 1950, is about granting citizenship to people, to Jewish people. And then you get into the bizarre situation where citizenship becomes the matter of a theological debate, not a theological debate in the Schmittian sense of theology, theology in the very strict sense of religious discussion about who is a Jew. And you had a lot of discussions on this kind in Israel. And so this dimension of the Zionist project led it also in the same way that the rabbis, the synagogues, and all that were seen as sites for the organization of the movement. This led also to a legitimation which was not purely based on the the actual situation of the European Jews and the situation of oppression that this was part, of course, of the story. And as it says in the same book, that the misery of the Jews is our propelling force of Zionism. But you have also the biblical legitimation, which is used, not in the book itself, but this would become a major, actually, dimension of the kind of legitimation that the Zionist movement will use, not only among Jews, but this would be what this would make it possible to appeal to Christian Zionism, what is called Christian Zionism. The biblical reference would be the point of convergence between Zionism and so-called Christian Zionism with its undertones of anti-Semitism, but that's also another story. Herzl, good friend, William Heschler, was a chaplain at the British embassy in Vienna, and is regarded as a founder of modern Christian Zionism. And this conversion was actually instrumental in even leading to the birth of the State of Israel. When we know the importance, Lord Balfour, the author of the famous declaration, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, is himself someone who belongs to this kind of perception of Christian Zionism. All this played quite an important role. There are a lot of historical works on this in bringing Britain to support to give the green light for the Zionist movement through this famous Balfour Declaration, offering a national home for the Jewish people. You can see here also again the national and the Jewish people. The issue, the kind of also the problem that I mentioned with the initial view that is in Herzl's book. Now, the Arab opposition to Zionism, to the Zionist enterprise in Palestine, which increased a lot, of course, after 1917, when the project became something regarded as a real threat, and not only as a vague and weak project. The Arab opposition, contrary to what Zionism represented, as I said, among European Jews, here we had the whole spectrum of political positions, since this was seen as a national danger for the Arabs as a whole. I'm speaking, of course, in terms of broad and major currents and ideological currents and groups, and notwithstanding this or that exception. And the full spectrum of ideological currents were mobilized in criticizing, in opposing the Zionist enterprise. I mean, I devoted actually my book to a study in details of these reactions. I won't dwell on this, but just to mention very quickly that I identified four major ideological sensitivities or currents in the Arab world as they formed especially in the interwar period between the two world wars. You have the liberal Westernizers who oppose Zionism from an attachment to liberal values and in the name of justice, that is the right of the autochthonous population of Palestine, while expressing sympathy with the Jews and the persecution they suffer European hands. You had the Marxists, who, of course, again, were opposed to Zionism, but from a perspective which was at the same time very radically very radically opposed to the range of far-right positions and anti-Semitism that you had in Europe. You had the nationalists, where you find a range of views, right to left, from flirtation with far-right European nationalism to left-wing nationalism, which is actually flirtation with the communist movement. But the key point here, I mean, all the three currents I mentioned were essentially rejecting Zionism from an anti-colonialist perspective. The key argumentation is anti-colonial. Zionism is seen as a colonial enterprise, whether by the liberalists, the Marxists, or the Marxists, or the nationalists. The fourth current is Islamic fundamentalism. And here, emphasizing the term fundamentalism, because you have Muslim thinkers among the liberal Western diaspora, for instance. You have a lot of Muslim thinkers. But I'm speaking here of fundamentalism, which is a specific interpretation that emerges in the Arab world, also in the war period, in the 20s, for reasons I don't have time to discuss, but it is in the 20s that we see the formation of modern Islamic fundamentalism. It was a key role for this for a theologian called Rashid, who is originally from Tripoli, which is now in Lebanon, part of Syria. Rashid played a key role in the formulation of modern Islamic fundamentalism and the concept of the Islamic State as it is used nowadays by Islamic fundamentalist currents. And he liaised, he actually built relations with, and you have a historical coincidence, but which has some further consequences for the region, with the emergence of, or the foundation of a kingdom in the heart of Arabia, controlling the holy places of Islam, and based on the most fundamentalist and most reactionary, most illiberal interpretation of Islam, which is Wahhabism, as it is called or used by others than those who belong to these views. And so you have this convergence between Rida and the Saudi kingdom from its inception, from its foundation. Rida will at the late 20s, as I showed tried to show in my book, will be the first to elaborate an Islamic fundamentalist discourse on the issue of Palestine, but one, and because of the dynamics of this confrontation, and that's also one feature of modern Islamic fundamentalism. This is the modernity, one part of the modernity in Islamic fundamentalism. The discourse went beyond traditional anti-Jewish elements or pronouncements that you can find in the Islamic corpus, as you find much more actually in the Christian corpus. The anti-Jewish Christian tradition was much harsher and broader than the Muslim one, Islamic one. So the fact is that Rhoda went far beyond what exists in the Islamic corpus, and he went into importing Western anti-Semitism into the Islamic discourse and in Arabic, into the Arabic language. And there he developed a discourse about the Palestinian issue, or about Zionism, which is actually just a mixture of traditional anti-Islamic, anti-Jewish pronouncements and Western anti-Semitic views, the whole gamut of protocols of the Elder of Zion, to the whole kind of conspiracy theories that were developing in Europe with the development of anti-Semitism in the interwar years. And this brand, this particular current, it is to this particular current that one person was very much quoted in all the discussions of these issues belong. And Hussein, the Mufti of Palestine, Jerusalem is called actually the Mufti of Palestine, designated to this post by the British and even by a Zionist High Commission from Britain. That's a footnote. Amin Husseini, who within the same logic will end up in 1941 moving to Europe, fleeing the region, fleeing the British, and spending the rest of the war between Berlin and Rome, and as a collaborator, as the most prominent Muslim collaborator of the Axis forces, and engaged in anti-Semitic propaganda and the rest, and a record that I did not hesitate to qualify as abject during those years. 41 is also, and this is ignored, but is the year that sees the end of the cooperation that existed since 1933 between the Zionist movement and Berlin in organizing the immigration of German Jews to Palestine, including circumventing the limitations put by the British to Jewish immigration into Palestine. This cooperation between the Zionist movement and Nazi Germany has been studied in great detail in what's probably the definitive book on that, which I recommend to anyone interested in the topic, by my friend, Professor of Holocaust Studies at Vermont University, Francis Nicosia. The book is called Zionism and Anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. Anyhow, so 41 is the year when this cooperation ends, and therefore we have here a shift. On the one hand, the end of any cooperation between the Zionist movement and Germany, and engagement of the Zionist movement in the fight against Germany, and on the other hand, Amin Husseini shifting to Europe and becoming a collaborator of the Axis powers. And this will, of course, feed the post-war discourse of the Zionist movement in this war of Arabs I'm leading. So after the war, the emphasis will be put by the Zionist movement on the turn on anti-Nazism, of course, keeping silent about the kind of events that I referred to, on the Holocaust, of course, and the building on the Holocaust, the legitimation of the Zionist project of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, with again the promise to take in the state those Holocaust survivors that are still in camps, in displaced person camps in Europe, and that was also an argument for governments that were, that's sad as it is, but that's how it is. Anti-Semitism was more pervasive than one might think, even among those who fought Nazism during the war. So the state was seen as an opportunity to solve this problem, sending all these people to somewhere else. And this led to the kind of partition that the UN adopted in 1947, the kind of resolution that the UN adopted in 1947 on the issue of the partition of Palestine. When you think of it, this was a resolution attributing to the Jewish state 56% of the territory of Palestine, of British invaded Palestine, at a time when the Jewish inhabitants of that territory were barely 1/3. So they were given they were given a majority of the territory, although they were only 1/3 of the population. And the idea beyond that was, behind that, was that this state would take in the Holocaust survivors. And therefore this was a key argument in this moment of the war of narratives, in which the Zionist movement was much more efficient than the Arab side. And this is the post-war period, the beginning of a systematic Nazification of the Arabs. A Nazification which also is used to justify and legitimize what happened in the 1948 war and the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinians from their territories. In this narrative, the 1948 war becomes some kind of last battle of the Second World War, or last battle against Nazism. And the Palestinians and Arabs are reduced to the figure of Amir Hussein and to Nazi-like people. And this Nazification of the enemy will carry on. This become a major part of the Zionist narrative. Nasser, of course, was extensively compared to Hitler and been Arab leaders, and have since also falling under this comparison. Now, at the time of Nasserism and the left-wing radicalization of Arab nationalism represented by Nasser, this was actually countered by turning the page on, by accusing Zionism of being a twin of Nazism. So you have accusation of comparison of Nasser to Hitler, and you have Nasserists and the Arab nationalist movement comparing Zionism to Nazism. So this was an exchange of these kinds of accusations and analogies. But at the very, at least one can say that in most cases there's an attempt to refer to values that we may regard as enlightened values of enlightenment. Nazism is absolute evil, and so therefore you want to curse the enemy, you will compare the enemy to Nazism. This kind of, the stage of the war of narratives will go to a turning point with the 1967 war, I already alluded to, and the 1973 war, the two wars of 1967 and 1973. And we will see through these two wars that I regard as a process, starts 67 and reaches an end in 73, or a completion in 73. A major shift toward the religious, the return or of the religious dimension in the world of narratives. On the Arab side, what we have since this shift is a steady rise of Islamic fundamentalism on the backdrop of the failure of Arab nationalism and the failure of other liberal or left alternatives to constitute any credible force. We will see a steady rise of Islamic fundamentalism also used, instrumentalized by the regimes, by Islamic regimes at the beginning. And all this will be boosted, of course, by the revolution in Iran, the so-called Islamic revolution in 1979. Nevertheless, the Palestinians, for reasons pertaining to the nature of the PLO, resisted more than other components of the Arab world this shift for quite a long time. Nevertheless, they ended up also being taken in the same, engulfed in the same trend after the failure of the first Intifada in 1997, or the deviation of this Intifada by the PLO leadership, which opened the field for the growth of Hamas, which was founded actually at the very beginning of the Intifada at the end of the year 1987. And so what we have had since this historical watershed is the rise of essentialization of the conflict, getting back to the kind of essentialization of the conflict that Rashid Rida, the theologian, mentioned, produced of course, through an Islamic fundamentalist perspective. This is what you get. On the Israeli side, we also have the same phenomenon. People tend to see it only on the Muslim side, but actually you have it also on the Israeli side, with the creation of the Gush Yemeni, the Block of Faith after the war of 73, the rise of religious colonization, no longer the strategic colonization of the along land. Sorry for those who don't know what it is, but too long to explain. But the post-1967 plan of how to control the occupied territories of the West Bank in particular had a view about the creation of strategic colonies, settlements in the West Bank. And here we got into another phase of colonization through religious settlements that will increase after 73. And this trend will lead to also a shift to the right in the Israeli society and politics that will be translated by the electoral victory of the Likud, that is what used to be the Zionist far right, actually, far right of the Zionist movement, the heirs of Jabotinsky, won the elections for the first time in Israel in 1977, and since then, most of the time, dominant Israeli politics, as you can see now, with the Likud-led government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And the Likud, in our eyes, was the religious right. And we have, of course, a very obvious rise in importance and influence of all types of religious fundamentalist movements and discourses in Israel, up to arrival of Ariel Sharon, who was to be regarded as the most radical among the Likud, the members of the Likud, arrival to power on the backdrop of the second Intifada and the military turn that it took, and the convergence with the Bush administration in the United States after 9/11 in the so-called war on terror. And you have this here, a strong return of Christian Zionism, and through the rise of the religious right in Israel itself, new bridges with Christian Zionism, which, as you know, was quite a strong influence on the Bush administration, on George W. Bush himself. And also, as part of the essentialization of the conflict, the Israeli side will play a key role in the development of what's called Islamophobia, in the recourse to Islamophobia discourse that will develop in the Western world after 9/11 in a rather spectacular manner. So what we have, what we see, according to the program, is actually, I'm speaking of a war of factors, but we can apply to it one of the key ideas of the most well-known theoretician of war, real Karl von Clausewitz, the rise to extremes. Well, this rise to extremes is here a kind of universal dynamics in modern war. We have it in the war of characters, and we have a rise to extremes through these events that I mentioned, which will take the form also of, for instance, more and more presence of anti-Semitic discourses on the Arab side, including Holocaust denial. Spectacular increase also of Holocaust denial over the last 25 years or more in the Arab world, ever since we have this shift that I mentioned. On the Israeli side, we will see, and that's the difference, I would say, between the Arabs, I mean, some Arabs, of course not all Arabs, but denying the Holocaust because they see in it the main legitimation used by their enemy, the Israeli enemy, and whereas what you have on the Israeli side, what you can see with regard to what the Palestinians and the Arabs see as their tragedy, the Nakba, as they call it, which by the way means the same as Shoah, which is a catastrophe. You have not a denial as existed before, which would be premised on some adhesion to enlightenment values. He didn't do it, that's wrong. They just fled because the leaders told them to flee, that is to the Palestinians when they left Palestine. No, instead of that, the shift I mentioned leads to justification for the Nakba. That's completely different. And we have crude illustration of that in the foremost historian of those who are called the new Israeli historians, Benny Morris, when he shifted radically to the right, and having been himself a historian, explaining and showing through his research in Israeli archives how the Nakba was indeed an act of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. In a famous interview in Haaretz in 2004, he uses the term ethnic cleansing, but he justifies it. He said it was needed, and actually the problem is that Ben Gurion stopped Jordan. And this is the kind of view that you get. So you have this rise to extremes in discourses on both sides, leading to what is in the very, very direct sense of the term, and that being here to be taken in the whole sense of the term, because this, when the war of narratives becomes a total war, then this leads also to the, as Kash would analyze quite well, actually, the annihilation of the enemy, and this, because of the need to do that, to dehumanize the enemy, to get into regarding the enemy as intervention. This is the kind of development that exists. So, I will conclude by stressing of course, in light of all that, which is quite the necessity to return to humanist values, if there is to be ever any real glimpse of hope with regard to this country. And humanist values here, which I think can or should become common ground if ever there is any peace to be built, are on the one hand the lessons of the Holocaust, assimilating the lessons of the Holocaust, but I will stress the fact that I'm here dealing with the universal lessons of the Holocaust. And there are two types of lessons that people build on the Holocaust. Like what you say, nie wieder, never again. It's either never again to the Jews, and then you have a narrow conception of the Holocaust, which you'll find in the Zionist right, especially in Zionist in general, and in some, let's say, unconditional supporters of Israel outside. And you have the never again period about Nazism as absolutely horrific, tragic experience in human history. And the universal lessons of the Holocaust are opposed against any form of racism, discrimination, oppression, physical domination, and the rest. And in stressing this, the universal lessons of the Holocaust, I see it just opportunity to pay tribute to a former president and rector of this university, the late Yehuda Elkana, who had an important contribution in emphasizing the importance of the universal approach to the Holocaust. These lessons are important also, in my view. It's very important for the Arab side, Palestinian side, and the Arab side in general, to acknowledge the importance of the Holocaust. If there are to be able to have a dialogue with the Israeli Jews, they have to understand what it means, because this is a major, it has become, whatever one think of the reason or the validity of it, but this is a fact that has become a key aspect of the Israeli psyche. And we have also the necessity of an analysis of the Nakba, what it represented, and there, even, as I said, even Israeli historians contributed to that. There was, of course, a lot of also studied that by Palestinian historians. The Nakba as an act of historical injustice, of ethnic cleansing, and the ongoing oppression. That's not only history, but also the present ongoing oppression, and actually in some ways increasing the oppression of the Palestinian people. So these, I think, are this mutual understanding, are the conditions for any true dialogue in the region. The conditions for, therefore, for just and perpetual peace. Otherwise, perpetual peace will be taken only in the meaning of this satirical inscription on the innkeepers that attracted attention of Immanuel Kant in giving the title of his Zum ewigen Frieden. And as you know, this was written on a drawing of a graveyard, a church. And what the French call, probably based on that, la paix des cimetières, the peace of cemeteries. So if we want to have perpetual peace, which is something other than this dreadful kind of peace, these are the conditions. Thank you very much.